You are listening to Over and Back's Basketball Mysteries of the 1970s. Today's mystery is, how wild did the ABA-NBA bidding wars get? Hey, this is Jason, and you are listening to part 3 of my discussion with Reinis Lacis of the Handle podcast about the battles off the court between the ABA and the NBA. In part 1, we talked about the ABA's formation and their battles over players in the late 1960s. In the second part, we talked about Spencer Haywood and his legal cases against the ABA, NBA, and college basketball establishment, and also talked about a 1970 merger agreement that ended up falling through that could have changed the course of basketball history. And in this part, we're going to talk about a lot of the bidding wars over players in the early 70s, particularly a case over Bob McAdoo and his secret contract, and also looking at how the ABA went after Bill Walton. And today we are brought to you by the Nothing But Nylon podcast. You know that Nylon Calculus is the place to go for smart but accessible analysis of all things in the NBA. And now there's a new podcast called Nothing But Nylon. Hosted by Kevin Farragon, it is a place where NBA writers and researchers discuss their ideas and talk hoops and analytics in a smart way. Check out Nothing But Nylon on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcasts, or find it at the Step Back. So we are joined in progress in 1972 as the bidding wars over players between the ABA and the NBA is beginning to heat up. February of 1972, as you mentioned, Jim McDaniels, he jumped from the Cougars to the Sonics. He was kind of a problem from the Cougars at the beginning. Used a draft pick on him and invested some resources in him, but he was by the time I think he was ready to go, even though it was only like half a season, I think they were ready for him to go because of how much of a headache he had been despite his talent. And then March of 1972, Charlie Scott jumped from the Squires to the Suns, and this is quite the fascinating story, which really puts the craziness of the 1970s in a nutshell in terms of these ABA-NBA battles. So this is all from Loose Balls. Charlie Scott, he's in his second season with Virginia. He talks the owner of the Squires, Earl Foreman, and their coach, Al Bianchi, into meeting with North Carolina star Bob McAdoo. McAdoo ends up signing a secret contract with the Squires while at North Carolina, and there are worries that, of course, it would be found out since he was still in school, would be found ineligible if that were the case. So Foreman put it into a safety deposit box, kept one key, and gave the other key to Charlie Scott. You need both keys to open the safety deposit box. Then, as we mentioned, Scott jumps to Phoenix. And then Foreman says he hears talk about McAdoo wanting to play for the Olympics in 1972. Now, it's one thing, of course, to ruin, the eligibility of a college player. It's quite another thing to ruin the eligibility of a team playing in the Olympics in 72. So at this point, Foreman is feeling very nervous and realizes that he probably can't keep McAdoo because he's under 21 and because of the hiding of the contract. And at this point, McAdoo ends up being drafted by Buffalo and wants to go there. So one day, Foreman gets a call from the Buffalo Braves owner, Paul Snyder, and who says, "We understand that there is a contract already signed by McAdoo." And Foreman responds, "I'm not saying there is or there isn't." And then Snyder offers to settle for $200,000 when Foreman thought he would get nothing out of it. So he had actually a pretty good deal for him. So someone gets the key from Charlie Scott, and then Snyder and Foreman meet at the bank to get the contract. They get it out of the safety deposit box, go to Earl Foreman's apartment, which Julius Erving lived at, I believe, during this time, actually. Snyder lights it with a match and then flushes it down the toilet and then gives Earl Foreman a certified check, which, all the secret contracts, the back table dealings, just all the craziness of the 70s in a nutshell, pretty much right there in that story.
Yeah, Earl Foreman's wife was probably preparing a meal for Julius as that was happening. But
yes.
The crazy part is that the 72-73 Virginia Squires hypothetically could have had Julius Erving, George Gervin, and Bob McAdoo all on the same team, and
yes,
Charlie Scott as well, if you want to
right,
run crazy with it. And
yes,
the illegitimate way that contract was signed probably robbed us of that trio, and it's probably robbed Foreman off of about $300,000 when he would have sold McAdoo to a stronger ABA team come All-Star time.
Yeah, absolutely right. So March of 72, the ABA filed a $300 million antitrust suit against the NBA asking for an injunction barring the player raids. Of course, they've just lost Charlie Scott, they've lost Jim McDaniels. Both of those in the middle of the season, or actually toward the end of the season, but still during the season. And eventually the NBA does stop the practice of trying to sign ABA players who are under contract and persuading them to jump over to the league during the season. And, otherwise it's pretty much the usual types of legal wranglings that are going on. But that's probably the major change that happens there. In April of 72, the Hawks end up signing Julius Erving, which I guess was the one exception to, it was during the offseason, but the one exception of this agreement is that the Hawks actually do try sign Erving while he's under contract with the Squires. As we've talked about we talked about our previous Julius Erving episode. Eventually, he plays a few exhibition games with the Hawks, but eventually ends up going back to the Squires. In June of 72, after Pittsburgh folded, John Brisker wanted to sign with Seattle. An NBA commissioner, Walter Kennedy, declared him a free agent. However, a week after the signing, Philadelphia filed formal charges claiming that Seattle's signing of Brisker violated NBA bylaws since he was still on Philadelphia's supplemental draft list from 1969. And then Kennedy went on to approve the contract, and Philadelphia brought the signing up to the NBA Board of Governors, who ruled that Seattle had violated the league constitution. Kennedy then fined Seattle $10,000, awards their first-round draft choice to Philadelphia. Then a judge weighs in, ruling that Kennedy had usurped the authority of the Board of Governors. And then this ends up delaying the NBA draft for 2 weeks, which is amazing. The Board of Governors restores the pick to Seattle and then awards a bonus selection at the end of the 73 draft and offers second-round draft selections from Seattle to sort of settle this dispute. But it's funny how Seattle is always involved in these crazy things of trying to bring ABA players over. But just another, could you imagine the NBA draft being delayed 2 weeks off of something like this?
And because of John Brisker, of all people, who was a great player during his day, but a bit of a malcontent. And it's interesting how the NBA sort of got burned after some of these moves. And Charlie Scott did have a good career, but between Jim McDaniels, John Brisker, and then Spencer Haywood, they got a few players who would get on their particular coach's nerves, and their careers didn't really turn out as good as they could have in the NBA.
Yeah, and you wonder if just the pressures of some of those circumstances of the way that they, particularly with Haywood, he had so much pressure on him and so much hatred toward him, and he was booed at all these arenas and dealt with quite a bit. The other guys, I don't know if they were going to turn into much anyway, but you wonder if Haywood at a certain point, if the pressures of all that, just made it harder on him to be able to, realize the talent that he had.
Yeah, unfortunately, he had to go through that, and he did a lot for future generations to come, but it certainly affected his own career. And interestingly enough, with that extra pick that the Sixers got in this whole deal, they drafted Raymond Lewis, the street ball legend who reportedly outplayed Doug Collins and then their rookie camp, and yet he had a contract dispute with the team, so he never played for any NBA franchise. So that's another footnote in all of this craziness. And he actually later on tried out with the Utah Stars, but Philadelphia threatened to sue. So Raymond Lewis never really had a professional basketball career.
Interesting. I that one I hadn't heard. That's interesting. So 72. The NBA for consensus All-Americans: Bob McAdoo, Henry Bibby, Tom Riker, Jim Price, and Isaac Stallworth. For the ABA, Jim Chones. Other notable players for the NBA: LaRue Martin, really notable for being one of the biggest busts, number one NBA picks of all time, and Paul Westphal. ABA, it's George Gervin, Don Busey, Brian Taylor, and James Silas. And we should mention McAdoo was the first underclassman drafted in the NBA.
Yeah, not to pile on poor LaRue Martin, but when you look at his college achievements and then the NBA career he had, Kwame Brown and Michael Olowokandi and players of that sort really don't deserve the criticism they get, because LaRue Martin really had a poor career for the pick with which he was selected by Portland.
Yeah, and he was regarded, seemingly a nice guy, and a guy who didn't really, unfortunately for him, he didn't ask to be picked first, but unfortunately, really one of the up until more modern times was absolutely the typified being a number one pick who was a bust. So in 1972, the Senate Judiciary Committee agrees to a merger bill, and there's some pretty crazy, some good things and also some pretty crazy attributes to this. It would do away with the reserve clause, but there was several amendments to the bill: no entry fee for ABA clubs, a guaranteed 30% of the home gate to visiting teams. All players should be signed to one-year contracts with an option for a second year. And my favorite one, a prohibition of television of Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday night games during the high school and college basketball season.
Yeah, that's an odd selection of amendments that had to be there. I wonder about the one-year contracts. I guess it would allow for freer player movement, but that also seems like a odd particularity to have.
Yeah, I don't know if that was just more of like, if that was a setting it up for, this is the first step in a new system, then you can have long-term contracts after that, but it was sort of getting everyone out of, maybe contracts they didn't want to be in and settling it there. Yeah, that was a little bit confusing to me, but yeah, that's an interesting one as well.
Yeah, I guess so. That would make more sense than just 1-year contracts till infinity from now on.
Right. Yeah. That I can't. Obviously, the league would not have gone for that. Not the other things as well. October 1972, Rick Barry forced to go to Golden State, as we talked about before, after he had played a couple seasons with the Nets, but had signed that Warriors contract previously and was held to it. He theoretically, I guess, could have sat out for another year and then played with the Nets. But he, at this point, felt he was too old to sit out another year, and was fine with going with the Warriors. He had wanted to go back there as well, although I think the Nets at the point was his preference. And then Irving forced to go back to Virginia, as we mentioned. This one I found interesting, and I couldn't find anything more about it, but November 1972, the ABA negotiated with the Philadelphia Spectrum to play a new team there. So it would have been really interesting to see a Philadelphia ABA team playing in the same arena as the 76ers. That would have certainly been an odd situation.
Yeah, and I do believe that it would be the year during which the 76ers won only 9 games, which used to be the record for the poorest win percentage. So the ABA team, which would have been there, might have had a shot at being the premier team in town.
Yeah, certainly they would have. Yeah, certainly they would have been a better. They could not have been a worse on the court product. But so 1973, in February, a New Jersey group agrees to buy the Chaparrals and turn them into the Jersey Giants, but the deal ended up falling through. Interesting that they were going to try these. I guess with the Philly team and the Jersey team are attempts to put teams into the Northeast, which of course had traditionally been the NBA's domain. In March of 73, a federal judge rules against the ABA's trademark claim of a red, white, and blue ball. It found that the coloring of the individual panels of the basketball was not sufficiently distinctive to be the subject of a statutory trademark. So that was addressed in Loose Balls a bit of, whether it was the fact that they couldn't get their act together, or, the fact that, they just couldn't trademark the actual colors of the ball. But that was certainly, if they had been able to be in charge of manufacturing the initial red, white, and blue balls and been able to get money from that, rather than everyone, they got some money from it, but anyone who wanted to could make that ball. That obviously may have changed the ABA's financial situation, given the number of red, white, and blue balls that were sold during that time.
And 1973 is a point where some of the franchises are beginning to fall off. In nearly 2 years, the two of them wouldn't finish the season, and then Baltimore and I'm blanking on the other one. So yeah, the owners could have really used a positive push like that at this point.
Also, March of 73, Senator Birch Bayh from Indiana introduced a bill that would allow a merger and do away with the uniform players contract and the option clause, but this alternative proved unpopular with the owners. The 1973, May of 1973, the third planned ABA-NBA All-Star Game would be canceled. So they had planned to do we mentioned the first two. In our previous episode, they planned a third one and actually even planned ones in the future, but it never came off after the first two. So the 1973 drafts, of the consensus All-Americans, the NBA got Doug Collins, Ernie DiGregorio, Kermit Washington, and Jim Brewer. The ABA got Bo Lamar, Larry Finch, and Kevin Joyce. Other notable players, the NBA didn't really have anyone particularly notable outside of the All-Americans. And the ABA had Mike Green, who was number 4 in the NBA draft, Larry Keenan, Caldwell Jones, Swen Nader, and ML Carr. This one's pretty close. There weren't really, none of these players are particularly, superstars in this case. DiGregorio, his career, he was at least looking at, in terms of fame, was looking like he would be a superstar. He's in a lot of ads during that time and was a very popular college player early in his pro career, but unfortunately injuries kept him from realizing his potential and making him retire very young. But everyone else kind of, some good players here, but not really. After the strong early 70s drafts, this was sort of a flat year for the draft. A lot of injuries limited the careers of these guys.
Yeah, the NBA probably won this one initially, but both Doug Collins's and as you said, Ernie DiGregorio's careers were cut short by injuries. And in a way, as was Kermit Washington's, he did put together a few solid years, and I think he might have been an All-Star one year. But yeah, when you hear his name, you always think of the punch, and that's the connotation his name has, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. So, July of 73, Walter Kennedy announces his retirement effective June of 1975. Sort of a lot made of Walter Kennedy not necessarily being the strongest commissioner ever. I mean, he was only I believe he was the second commissioner in NBA history. Almost every commissioner has had quite a long term, but he was sort of considered wishy washy, I guess, is the best term in terms of not really, taking strong stands and not really being able to, control a lot of things that were going on in the league. And certainly this is somewhat of a period of, obviously there's tremendous change in the league, but there's also, kind of settling into some stagnation in terms of, the business of the NBA isn't necessarily growing as fast as, the expectations had been, in the late 60s and early in the 70s.
And the big mistake he made, besides seemingly losing to the ABA and a lot of these wars, I don't know if any other commissioner would have done better, but going to NBA to CBS in the place of NBA on NBC really made the NBA fall back in regards to its TV coverage, because the ABC station made sure that they would present American football whenever NBA basketball was on, and I think they used some marketing techniques of putting college football and at the same time slots as the NBA would. So that move really cost the NBA several years of progress. In 1980, as we all know, they still were broadcasting the Lakers Sixers finals on tape delay.
Yeah, the CBS deal, even though the CBS was a more prestigious station at the time, the ABC had stronger marketing and was willing to kind of, it was more of an afterthought on CBS. It was a much smaller fish in a bigger pond, where it was a bigger fish in the smaller pond that was ABC. September of 73, Wilt Chamberlain signs with the Conquistadors, initially to be player coach, but unfortunately for him, the federal court rules he can't play, so he only coaches. Rich and I went through that in a previous episode. January of 74, the 1971 merger agreement lapses, so they no longer have that 3-year window. The ABA revived its antitrust suit again, seeking $100 million in damages against the NBA. The NBA Board of Governors responds by voting 18-0 against any merger with the ABA. So the rhetoric heats up again. I think we may have talked about where Mike Storen, who's the commissioner at this point, is giving a lot of quotes to the press about how the ABA has all these plans to go after the NBA, and they're going to go after stronger talent and so on and so forth. I think that was mostly him blowing smoke, but he was effective in that role of being kind of a spokesman advocate for the league, and gave them better leadership than they had over the past couple of years.
Yeah, certainly a better commissioning tenure than Walter Kennedy had.
So, speaking of which, April of 1974, there are Bill Walton is heading into the NBA. He would be drafted in 74, and there are a lot of ABA attempts to woo him. There were even some attempts previously in 73 by the San Diego Q's owner, Leonard Bloom, who was trying to woo Walton as a hardship case, which is funny given that Walton, came from a middle class background, and it was kind of pointed out, like, I don't know if Walton's family's really that hard up for money. And Bloom's quote is, "How many of these guys have been out and out hardship cases in the past? Hardship is however you want to define it." So basically, openly admitting that hardship is, not a real thing. But there was talk of ABA attempting to organize a Los Angeles team with Walton playing there, Jerry West as coach. I forget who tells the story in Loose Balls, but there's basically a story of Walton when he met with the ABA saying, like, he wants to be the highest paid player, but he wants to be on a team that already has established stars and doesn't want to be responsible for winning, which he was sort of like, wait a minute, you want to be the highest paid player, but you don't want to be responsible for winning. Walton himself said he thought the quality of the ABA play just wasn't good enough. He wouldn't be challenged there, and he said that they tried to use the weather of Portland against him. So it's a very different stories based on who you ask about Walton and the ABA and their negotiations for him. But that was definitely they were very aggressive about trying to do that, seeing him as somebody who could make a difference in terms of, giving the league some needed attention.
Yeah, one has to wonder how things would have turned out differently if the ABA would have gotten either Bill Walton or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who were the two generational bigs of that decade. Someone like Artis Gilmore, of course, was a great player, a nice player, but both Walton and Jabbar proved that they can build a team to a title by not by themselves, but by leading a decent group of guys. So the ABA never really got that generational big type of player. They mostly had very good wing players. So yeah, that would have been a different situation with Walton playing for a LA Bruins team.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing with Walton and Kareem, of course, is just they would come in with this established pedigree of being part of UCLA, and that would have they were stars. I mean, Artis Gilmore was a great player in the ABA, absolutely tremendous player, but he didn't he came from a relatively small college and wasn't as well known, and was dynamic in his own way, but he didn't bring the audience with him that Kareem would have or Walton would have. Of course, Walton would have dealt with the injuries where that certainly almost certainly would have been the same issue in the ABA that it was in the NBA. So perhaps it wouldn't really have done much for the ABA. But Kareem, that's another one that's obviously a very fascinating question, and I think it certainly would have made some difference. But he was also a guy who had an adversarial relationship with the press, and maybe wasn't quite the box office attraction that he theoretically should have been. But obviously interesting to think about. May of 74, Billy Cunningham returns to the NBA, so another established NBA star who heads back to the NBA after an ABA stint. Most of the major stars, as we mentioned, did the same thing. Jim Chones, who was one of the first underclassmen to leave early for the pros in 72. There's a famous Al McGuire quote where he said, "I've looked in his refrigerator and in mine. Mine was full, his was empty," was one of the justifications for feeling like Chones was justified in going. Al McGuire, as you mentioned, very progressive in that sense, as opposed to many other college coaches. In this case, he leaves the ABA for the NBA, going from the Cougars to the Cavs via the Lakers, who had his draft rights. And Pete Newell, who was the Lakers GM at the time, said that it was the only ABA-NBA three-way trade ever, and made Chones the only player to ever jump leagues with a lawsuit. So I found that idea amusing, because I think that is, I'm not sure about the only three-way trade ever, but it was definitely almost certainly the only player to jump leagues without a lawsuit.
Yeah, and Louis Balls has actually quite a long monologue by Jim Chones. I'm not sure how the interview went, the interview process between him and Terry Pluto, but he described in detail his time in Marquette and basically growing up in poor conditions, and how he struggled initially in the ABA because he was not ready for the professional world of basketball. So yeah, that's definitely an interesting account in regards to all of the things mentioned here, whether it was him leaving college early or ending up in the NBA in a way that didn't involve a lawsuit. So that was one of the many interesting stories from the Loose Balls that make it a absolutely fantastic book on basketball history.
All right, this is the end of part 3 of our conversation. Stay tuned for the final part, where we will talk about George McGinnis leaving for the NBA, David Thompson heading to the ABA, and the ABA almost breaking apart, and then finally the merger between the two leagues. So you should check out Reinis' stuff at lamarmaddock.com. He has a great podcast and a great YouTube channel, all worth checking out. And you can find us at The Step Back at fansided.com. You can also find us on iTunes or Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcast. Just search for Over and Back. And you can find us on Twitter and Facebook at Over and Back NBA. So thanks for listening, and we'll be back again soon.